Everett Callahan was already at his table when the waiter returned, leaning in to murmur that the kitchen was running a bit behind. Everett nodded, courteous as always, his gaze fixed on the empty chair opposite him. Christmas Eve. Prime rib on order. A packed dining room humming with conversation. And somehow, he was the only person with an untouched place sitting across from him. That wasn't what hurt most. His hand slipped into his coat pocket, fingertips finding the small velvet box he never opened anymore. It had sat there for years undisturbed, an unkept promise preserved like something trapped in ice. This night had once belonged to a different life, one that never arrived. He'd pictured laughter, high voices, two little girls negotiating dessert. Instead, there was only the clink of cutlery and other people's joy. Across the room, families leaned over shared plates, trading stories and inside jokes. Children swung their legs under the tables, breathless with excitement, arguing about presents and dessert. Everett kept his eyes lowered, pretending his phone deserved his full attention. He told himself it was just another dinner on just another night. But Christmas Eve has a way of stripping away that kind of lie. If you believe in quiet decency and the courage of ordinary kindness, you already understand how a single small choice can alter everything. He checked his watch, not because he was in a rush, but because waiting was easier than remembering why nights like this felt like a test. The empty chair across from him remained perfectly straight, deliberately placed. It was meant for someone who never got the chance to sit in it, and Everett had built an empire around not thinking about that fact. Then the door opened again, ushering in a breath of cold air and a flurry of snow. A woman stepped inside, brushing off her coat with one hand while holding two smaller hands with the other. The girls were identical. Same springy curls, same bright eyes, same red bows anchored over their ears. They looked around the restaurant as if it were a fairy tale brought to life. Everett didn't look up yet, but something in the atmosphere shifted. The hostess bent toward the woman, speaking quietly and gesturing to a table in the corner. One of the twins slipped her hand free and walked ahead, her shoes tapping gently on the floor. Halfway there she stopped. She was staring at Everett. Not with idle curiosity or shyness, but with calm certainty, as if she'd just found exactly what she'd been searching for. He felt the moment before he consciously noticed her. That subtle pull when life is about to divide into before and after. When he finally raised his eyes, he wasn't prepared for the clear, assessing gaze fixed on his face. The little girl tilted her head, studying him. Then she smiled small, sure. She stepped closer without hesitation. Her sister whispered her name from behind her, but she didn't slow. Everett opened his mouth, though he had no idea what to say or why his heartbeat had suddenly gone uneven. He didn't know what she was about to do, or that his carefully organized life was about to crack along a new line. Everett Callahan had built his world around things that didn't ask anything of him emotionally. Numbers behaved. Systems responded to logic. Companies followed rules if you were precise enough. People, on the other hand, were variables he had learned to keep at arm's length. Felt safer that way. Or so he'd convinced himself. At 41, Everett was a self-made millionaire CEO, the face of a successful financial technology firm. Clean record. No scandals. No messy headlines. Business magazines called him disciplined, focused, relentless. They never mentioned the vacant apartments or the holidays where he pretended that inboxes and quarterly reports were enough to fill the silence. Once there had been someone else in that story. A woman who laughed often and refused to take his schedules too seriously. She teased him about his color-coded calendar, about the way he treated life like a series of deadlines. She had already chosen names for their someday children. 2 girls, she'd said. Always 2. Then one quiet afternoon, the phone rang and divided his life into before and after. No villain. No warning. Just the kind of news that doesn't make sense no matter how many times you replay it. That day, something vital in Everett had shut down. Love became a room he locked tight. Work became the one place grief couldn't quite overtake. He measured life in profits and product launches, in staff expansions and contracts with too many zeros. He bought himself stillness with long hours and control. When people asked why he'd never married, he offered a polite smile and changed the subject. Some stories were easier left untold. And every Christmas Eve scraped against that locked door. This year he'd chosen a crowded restaurant on purpose. Noise made it easier to pass for normal. In a room this full, nobody looked twice at a man minding his own business. The waiter knew who he was but treated him like everyone else. Everett appreciated that. No special attention, no intrusive friendliness. Just service. That was when he really noticed the woman. She was a little underdressed for the room, but not uncomfortable. There was a steady, practical grace in the way she moved the twins around chairs and servers, keeping them close without dimming their excitement. The girls whispered to each other, eyes shining. A familiar ache tightened in Everett's chest before he understood it. He'd imagined a moment like this once. Not this particular woman, not these specific girls, but the configuration. A mother, 2 daughters, Christmas Eve. A future outline he'd never gotten to fill in. He looked away too quickly, irritated with himself. Coincidence, that was all. His mind playing tricks. Their life had nothing to do with his. Or so he believed, right up until the girl stopped beside his table. She was close enough that he could see the scatter of freckles across her nose. She wasn't smiling like a child scheming for a treat. Her expression was composed like someone who'd just made an important decision. Everett straightened automatically, lungs a little too tight. He had sat through investor conferences and high-stakes negotiations. None of that had prepared him for this. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the low hum of the restaurant, "nobody should be alone on Christmas Eve." The sentence landed gently, but it went straight to the center of him. He blinked, caught off guard by how impossible it was to argue with her logic. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to pause. Behind her, the woman froze, eyes widening in alarm. "I am so sorry," she whispered as she rushed forward. "She's very observant." Her hand reached for the girl's shoulder, ready to steer her away. Everett lifted his own hand slightly, signaling that it was all right. The second twin peered out from behind her sister, the same features arranged into a more cautious curiosity. She watched Everett carefully, absorbing everything. The first girl tilted her head again, waiting for his answer. There was no fear in her stance. No self-consciousness. Just a sturdy kindness that assumed its own validity. "Would you like 3 good companions for dinner?" she added. "Just for tonight." Something long dormant shifted under Everett's ribs. He thought of the empty chair. Of how long it had been since anyone had asked to share his table. The woman's cheeks flushed as she tried again to apologize. "We really didn't mean to intrude," she said, mortified. "We were just passing by." Everett shook his head slowly, mind scrambling to catch up with the quiet, insistent yes forming in his chest. "No," he said gently, then choosing his words. "Please, stay." He looked from the girl to her sister, then up at their mother. "Yes," Everett repeated, steadier this time. "I'd like that." The girl's smile wasn't loud or showy, just satisfied, as if a puzzle piece had clicked into place. Their mother, Lauren, he would later learn, hesitated, caught between pride, caution, and something that looked suspiciously like hope. The twins turned their faces up to her, waiting, eyes bright. Everett gestured to the empty chair and the spots beside it. "There's more than enough food," he said quietly. And just like that, 3 strangers stepped across an invisible line into a story none of them had scheduled. Lauren Whitmore stood still for a second longer than made sense. It wasn't Everett she distrusted, it was moments like this. Life had taught her that good things usually arrived with invisible costs. Her first instinct was always the same. Protect the girls. From harm, from disappointment, from generosity that came with hooks. Her daughters, however, required no convincing. They slid into the chairs with careful excitement, hands folded, posture dignified, as if this were a ceremony. Christmas Eve dinner with a stranger felt important. Lauren watched, alert, ready to intervene. Everett saw the wariness in her shoulders immediately. He knew that look. It was the gaze of someone measuring every move. He softened his own stance. Slower gestures, quieter voice, nothing that could feel like pressure. "I'm Everett," he said simply, offering only his name, not his resume. Lauren nodded cautiously. "I'm Lauren." Her fingers rested lightly on the table edge. "And these are my daughters." A tiny pause, then a faint smile. "Ava and Lily." The twins announced their names at the same time and burst into giggles. The sound cut through Everett like sunlight. It was a kind of laughter he'd almost forgotten, unguarded, unpolished. Something inside his chest loosened by a fraction. The waiter reappeared with menus, glancing between Everett and his unexpected guests. "They'll be joining me," Everett said, calm and matter-of-fact. The waiter nodded and left them to it. An awkward quiet settled in his wake. Lauren studied Everett's face as if trying to read the small print. The girls whispered to each other, legs swinging under the table. Everett stared at the tablecloth, suddenly aware of how unpracticed he was at this. Lauren broke the silence first, voice steady but careful. "We didn't plan on any of this," she said. "We almost stayed home tonight." He met her eyes properly for the first time. "Then I'm glad you didn't," he replied, and realized he meant every word. Something fragile but unmistakable hung between them. This wasn't rescue and it wasn't charity. It was three people and one quiet man sharing a narrow path between hope and self-protection. Everett understood that what happened next would matter. The food arrived, bringing the comforting smell of roasted meat and butter and herbs. The girls' attention shifted to their plates. Lauren exhaled just a little. Everett watched the practiced efficiency with which she cut their food, reminded them of manners, and still managed to smile. This outing wasn't routine for them. It was a rare splurge she was determined to make count. At first, they ate in the cautious silence of strangers negotiating boundaries. Then Everett asked the girls what they liked most about Christmas. Ava said she loved the lights because they made everything look softer. Lily said she liked how people smiled more, even when they were tired. Lauren's mouth curved at that, then she quickly looked down. Everett asked where they'd come from. His voice stayed light. Lauren hesitated, then answered plainly. They lived a few subway stops away in a small apartment. Going out to dinner like this was not tradition. It was something she'd promised herself she would try just once this year. She worked 2 jobs, mostly nights. The girls stayed with a neighbor many evenings. Tonight she wanted to show up fully, instead of passing through their day on her way to work. She admitted that she'd nearly turned around at the restaurant door. Everett listened without cutting in, a skill he'd earned through loss, not leadership. He noticed how she sidestepped certain specifics, how carefully she chose which details to share. This was not a story made for sympathy. It was one held together by responsibility and fatigue. Then Ava looked up, napkin pressed to her lips. "Mom," she said matter-of-factly, "tell him why Christmas Eve is our thing." Lauren stiffened, caught by the directness. She took a breath. Their father had died years ago, she explained. Not suddenly but slowly, after a long illness that turned time into something heavy and elastic. Christmas Eve had been his favorite night. It was the one piece of their old life she refused to relinquish. Everett felt her words hit something deep. Grief recognized its reflection without needing explanations. He didn't share his own history yet, but the orientation of his pain shifted. It was no longer clenched inward. It was listening. He didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. He let it stand, not as awkwardness but as respect. The girls kept eating, entirely at home, as if they'd always belonged at this table. That ease settled into him, taking up a space usually occupied by loneliness. Lauren noticed the way he withheld easy consolation. No platitudes, no advice. Just a simple, "How long ago?" asked without an agenda. She answered in plain terms. By the time she finished, the girls had already chimed in with their own memories, how their dad used to sing off-key carols in the kitchen every Christmas Eve. They corrected each other's stories, laughing around mouthfuls, turning what could have been a sad anecdote into something solid and alive. Everett pictured it. A cramped kitchen, cheap decorations, the clatter of mismatched plates, a voice a little too loud and a lot off-key. The image felt more real than his own polished but fragmented memories. At some point, Lauren asked quietly what he did for work, clearly expecting him to brush past it. When he told her he ran a company, she only nodded. No impressed questions. No curiosity about revenue or recognition. Instead, she asked, "Do you like it?" The question hit harder than any shareholder query he'd faced. He paused. Then he told her what he could say out loud. That he liked the structure, the predictability, the assurance that each day contained problems he knew how to solve. What he didn't add was that work kept his mind busy enough to drown out old echoes. She seemed to understand anyway. That wordless understanding, a stranger reading between his sentences, made him feel unexpectedly seen. The girls, having cleaned their plates, began doodling on their paper placemats. After a while, Ava slid her drawing across the table. 4 stick figures sat at a table like theirs, one taller than the rest. "Does it look right?" she asked. He nodded, swallowing around an inexplicable tightness. It wasn't the crude lines that got to him. It was what they represented. A place at the table offered without any conditions. He excused himself softly and walked toward the big front window, needing a moment to steady his breathing. Outside, snow softened the hard edges of the city. People hurried past, arms full of bags and wrapped boxes, moving toward someone somewhere. For years he'd argued that independence was strength, that solitude was peace. Looking out at those bundled figures, he understood that what he'd really been avoiding wasn't pain. It was significance. When he returned to the table, he made a decision that didn't come from logic. "Would you 3 stay a bit longer?" he asked. "Maybe we could share dessert." He added quickly, "Only if you want to. No pressure." Lauren did the mental math: a late night, the subway, energy for work in the morning. The girls answered for her. Their entire faces lit up. He chose not to retreat. Dessert arrived. 3 plates set in front of the girls and 1 in front of him, each portion large enough to pass around without discussion. Lauren thanked the waiter and, by reflex, reached for her wallet. Everett shook his head lightly. There was no grand insistence, just quiet certainty. She studied him for a second, then nodded once, accepting in a way that didn't make her smaller. The girls leaned in, negotiating bites and erupting in giggles whenever crumbs tumbled onto the table. Everett asked what they wanted to be when they grew up. He expected teacher, astronaut, vet. Ava said she wanted to build houses, so families wouldn't have to move all the time. Lily wanted to help sick people feel less afraid when they went to the doctor. Everett glanced at Lauren and saw a flicker of emotion before she controlled it. These were not random dreams. They were answers carved out of experience. She explained that, over the years, stable had become their shared goal. After their father's death, the girls learned early to read the room, to notice tension in an adult's shoulders, changes in tone, the subtle signs that something was wrong. Everett felt a familiar ache. He knew what it meant to grow up fast because circumstances left you no other choice. The conversation slowed, softening at the edges. Time seemed to give them a little extra room. Finally, Everett crossed a line he'd promised himself he wouldn't cross with strangers. He spoke carefully about the future he'd once imagined. Not in detail, not with names, but with enough honesty that the loss behind it was clear. Lauren listened without interruption, without trying to soothe him. That restraint was the exact comfort he needed. Ava looked up, dessert fork hovering in midair. "Do you still want that future?" she asked, voice calm and genuinely curious. He stopped, surprised by the directness. No adult would have asked it quite that way. He considered the answer. There was no kindness in lying to a child who'd already learned too much truth. "Yes," he said at last. "I think I do." The word hung between them, altering the shape of the night. Lauren's gaze met his, not with expectation, but with the recognition of someone who had once declared herself finished wanting, and then discovered she wasn't. The girls nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned their full attention to the melting dessert. Everett felt something unfamiliar. Warmth that felt suspiciously like hope. Outside, snow kept falling, muting the city's edges. Inside, he realized he was no longer counting down to the polite moment to leave. He was actually there, with them, instead of hovering at a safe distance from his own life. When the check came, he signed it without glancing at the number. As he laid the pen down, he made a quiet promise to himself. Not about rescuing anyone or buying solutions. Just this, to stay open even when it was easier to shut down. He didn't know what this connection could become. He only knew that something had begun, and walking away from it would be a different kind of loss. Outside the restaurant, in the blue-white glow of the streetlights, he expected the old familiar drop in his chest, the heavy descent that came whenever something good ended. Instead, he felt a gentle, unfinished curve, as if the night were a sentence that had paused at a comma, not stopped at a period. Lauren thanked him again, this time meeting his eyes without flinching. That alone told him the evening had mattered to her. The girls hugged him quickly and confidently, the way children do when something feels safe by instinct. Then they disappeared down the subway stairs, red bows bobbing. Everett stood on the sidewalk longer than he needed to, letting the cold bite his cheeks. For years he had trained himself to exit cleanly, to seal doors before feelings complicated the floor plan of his life. Tonight he didn't rush. He replayed the girls' laughter, the way Lauren had listened without trying to fix him. The unease that settled in his chest felt strangely necessary, as if it were making space for something new. The following days were busy in all the expected ways: meetings, travel, spreadsheets, decisions with long shadows. But Everett found that the machinery of his life no longer absorbed him completely. He noticed little hesitations where there had once been automatic motion. He questioned why every request still felt urgent. Idly, in the middle of a board meeting, he caught himself wondering whether Lauren was at work or at home, whether the girls were still talking about dessert and drawings. Lauren slammed herself back into routine with the same discipline that had kept her world from unraveling. Morning rushes, packed lunches, hand-me-down backpacks, shifts, dishes, homework, bedtime stories. Everything measured, nothing wasted. But the girls kept bringing Everett up in casual mentions. Not as a fantasy savior, but as a real person who had listened to them like their words mattered. They talked about the restaurant, about how he'd remembered their questions, about the way he'd stayed. Lauren noted, carefully, that their interest wasn't in what he had, but how he'd been. One night, after both twins had finally fallen asleep, Lauren sat alone at the small kitchen table and let herself think without instantly shutting the thoughts down. Letting people in had never ended well for her. Yet Everett hadn't tried to wedge himself into their daily life. He hadn't made big promises or asked for anything. That restraint made the memory of him feel steadier, not more distant. Somewhere across the city, Everett sat at his pristine kitchen island, typing and deleting the same few lines. He wanted to reach out without implying more than he was ready, or able, to give. He wanted to be honest without burdening her. After far too many revisions, he sent a short message, thanking her for sharing the night, saying he'd been thinking of them, leaving the door open, not pride. He'd signed bigger contracts with a steadier hand. Lauren read the message late, perched at the edge of her bed so the girls wouldn't hear the buzz of her phone. She read it 3 times, scanning for pressure or subtext. What she found was gratitude, clarity, and a deliberate respect for her boundaries. She replied briefly, not to hold him back, but to allow the connection to move at a pace that felt sustainable. The simplicity was a choice, not a defense. Over the next weeks, their communication settled into a quieter rhythm. Occasional texts, a photo of a lopsided snowman from the twins, a comment about a long day, answered by a sympathetic line. No games, no urgency. Everett discovered how much closeness could exist without intensity. Lauren learned that consistency didn't automatically equal obligation. Still, doubt surfaced in the blank spaces. He wondered if he was walking toward a life he didn't know how to maintain. She wondered what it meant to let her daughters grow accustomed to someone who could, theoretically, vanish. They both felt the responsibility from different directions. Neither voiced those fears yet. Naming them too soon felt like pressing on glass that hadn't fully set. The girls, meanwhile, sensed growth where adults saw risk. They began casually inserting Everett into their future plans. Next Christmas, maybe Everett will. When we go back to that restaurant, we should show Everett. Lauren corrected gently when they slipped too far into assumption, but she didn't shut them down. She trusted their instincts more than she trusted her own scar tissue. One late evening, Everett sat alone in his high-rise apartment. The city spread beneath him like a circuit board. The silence that had once felt like a reward now felt unfinished. He realized solitude could only be peace if it was truly chosen, not defaulted to out of fear. For the first time in years, he admitted to himself that he didn't want to back away. Not this time. The envelope arrived on an utterly ordinary afternoon, mixed in with utility bills and impersonal finance reports. Everett almost tossed it aside, assuming it was more paperwork. Then he saw the handwriting. Rounded, careful letters, neither rushed nor formal. Not business. His pulse ticked up. Inside, there was no long letter spilling feelings across the page. Just a single folded note and a drawing, tucked in so precisely it was clear someone had made sure it wouldn't crease. The drawing showed 4 figures around a table again, but this time with more intention. 2 smaller ones had their bodies angled toward a tall one. Next to him, a woman sat close, not apart. Outside the drawn window, snow fell. Inside there was light. At the bottom, in uneven but determined block letters, were the words, "Thank you for staying when you didn't have to." Everett sat down slowly, the paper still in his hands. That sentence held him in place. Not because it was sweet, but because it articulated something he'd never really named. He had spent a lifetime excelling at staying in places measured by outcomes. Offices, negotiations, problem-solving marathons. But in emotional spaces, places where attachment and loss coexisted, he had perfected the art of leaving early. The note didn't accuse him. It simply noticed. Lauren's accompanying letter was short and straight. No appeals. No hidden requests. She wrote that the girls had talked about that night more than she had expected. Not as an extraordinary treat, but as proof that people could show up with kindness and not disappear the next day, that not every good moment had to be followed by a crash. She mentioned, almost in passing, that the twins had slept more peacefully that week. She wanted him to know his presence had mattered in ways that had nothing to do with money or effort. He read the lines twice, then again slower. He had built his identity on what he produced and controlled. On measurable value. What she described was an impact without strategy, significance without a plan. It felt foreign. And essential. The drawing pulled up a memory he usually kept sealed away. Sitting on the floor of a much smaller apartment years earlier, his then-fiancée sprawled beside him, talking effortlessly about the future. Children had not been an if for her. They were a when. She spoke of family like something love naturally grew into. He'd smiled, nodded, and told himself he would catch up to her certainty. Now, holding the twins' drawing, he understood something both painful and freeing. He hadn't been wrong to want that kind of life. He had just been afraid to risk living it. That night, he didn't drown the realization in work or turn on the TV for background noise. He placed the drawing on his desk in plain view and left it there. For once, the quiet of his apartment didn't feel like an echo chamber. It felt like space that could be used differently. He understood that what happened in that restaurant last Christmas wasn't a comforting anecdote to file away. It was an invitation. Across the city, Lauren watched her daughters coloring at their worn kitchen table, crayons scattered like bright debris. They were relaxed, unguarded, humming fragments of a song. She wondered briefly if she'd overstepped by sending the letter and drawing. Then she remembered why she'd done it. She was tired of raising them to expect withdrawal, to brace for people to disappear the moment feelings were expressed. She wanted them to see that gratitude could be spoken without fear, that some adults could receive it without bolting, that honesty didn't always trigger consequences. In separate apartments under separate ceilings, Everett and Lauren reached the same conclusion. Whatever existed between them wasn't about rescue or fantasy. It was about choice. And once you recognize a choice, you're responsible for what you do with it. Their lives had already shifted. The question now was whether they would let that shift continue. The next Christmas Eve arrived without fanfare. No dramatic countdown. Just another day circling back on the calendar, quiet and insistent, like a test of everything they hadn't quite said out loud. Out of habit, Everett spent the morning answering emails and reviewing reports. Halfway through a call, he heard himself speaking and realized he was using work the same old way, as camouflage. He ended the call politely, closed his laptop, and changed into a simple dark sweater. Then he stood by his window, watching the city in its winter coat. The skyline looked the same. He didn't. He wasn't aiming to impress anyone tonight. He just wanted to be fully there. He arrived at the restaurant early, not to control the evening, but because he didn't want them to step through the door and wonder if he would come. The hostess recognized him, smiling as she offered a private, quieter table. He shook his head. Same table as last year, please. Not because he believed in lucky spots, because it was familiar. And for the first time, familiar no longer felt like a graveyard of what-ifs. Felt like a starting point. He sat and for once didn't reach for his phone. He set it face down and folded his hands loosely on the table, watching people arrive, noticing that the crowded room no longer made him feel exposed. He felt included even before anyone had joined him. A few minutes later, Lauren walked in, and Everett was halfway to his feet before his mind caught up with his body. Ava and Lily raced ahead. Both slightly askew, a little taller, moving with the unself-conscious energy of girls who had grown a year and a layer of confidence. They didn't ask if they could hug him. They just did. Their arms wrapped around his waist, and for a split second his old instinct to freeze, to manage the moment, flared. He didn't yield to it. He bent down, hugging them back. The sensation of small hands clutching his sweater hit him with a startling sense of absence he hadn't known he was carrying. Lauren watched the exchange carefully. Her expression was tentative at first, then gradually softened when she saw there was no stiffness in him, no performance. They sat. The girls launched into rapid-fire updates, as if picking up a conversation paused, not ended. School projects. A too strict teacher. A classmate who cried in the bathroom, and how Lily had passed her a tissue under the stall. Everett listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that proved he remembered the details they'd shared over the past year. He asked about the neighbor who watched them some evenings by name. He remembered their favorite dessert. Lauren didn't comment, but something subtle changed. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. Her breathing eased. Her body recognized something her mind was still reluctant to name. Consistency. Halfway through the meal, she excused herself to the restroom. Everett stayed at the table with the twins. Ava leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially. She said their mother had been nervous all day, not because she didn't want to come, but because she didn't want to hope too much. Lily added that their mom still woke up early even on days off, like she didn't quite know how to relax. Everett listened. He didn't rush to volunteer himself as an answer. He simply said he was glad they came, and that their mother was doing an incredible job. The girls accepted his words not as flattery, but as confirmation of something they already suspected. When Lauren returned, the girls exchanged a look, then produced a carefully folded paper from Ava's backpack, handling it with ceremonial gravity. They laid it on the table and nudged it toward Everett. This drawing was more detailed than the last. For figures bundled in winter coats walked through swirling snow. In the background, a glowing window showed the outline of a restaurant table. Underneath, in neat block letters, Ava had written, "Families can start anytime." Everett stared at the drawing longer than he intended. His throat tightened, but he didn't look away or deflect with a joke. He let the words sit where they landed. Lauren watched his reaction and saw something she hadn't seen in him before. A man not running from his own response. She spoke slowly, weighing each word. "I'm not looking to rush anything," she said. "And I'm not asking for promises. What matters to me is consistency, safety, choice. The girls have had enough change. So have I." He nodded, feeling no urge to argue or over-reassure. "I understand," he told her. "I'm not here to fill a role you already lost. I'm here because I want to keep showing up. That's all I know how to promise." The simplicity of that landed with more force than any grand declaration. It wasn't fantasy. It was a decision. When the check came, he took care of it without ceremony, just as he always did. He didn't make a show of generosity or insist on being acknowledged. It was one more quiet act in a growing pattern. Outside, they walked toward the subway together. Ava slipped her small hand into Everett's as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lily took Lauren's. The four of them moved through the crowd like a small self-contained unit, not pretending to be something defined, not denying what they were becoming. At the subway entrance, the girls hugged him again, promising to send another drawing. Lauren looked at him, hesitation flickering for only a second. "Thank you for staying," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere," he answered. He meant tonight. But the sentence carried more than one meaning. Back in his apartment, Everett placed the new drawing beside the first on his desk. Last year's simple table. This year's four figures walking forward together. He understood then that healing didn't erase what had been lost. It simply meant the past no longer dictated every possible ending. He glanced around his immaculate living room and noticed it no longer looked like a showroom dedicated to success. It looked like a space someone could enter and inhabit. He picked up his phone, typed out a message to Lauren, and sat with it for a moment, not out of fear but out of respect. He wanted his words to match his choices. When he finally hit send, one thing was perfectly clear to him. This wasn't a fairy tale. No magic wands. No guarantees of a perfect, unbroken future. This was real life. Messy, tentative, hard one. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like a life worth staying for. Stories like this don't fix the world, but they remind us of something easy to forget. That quiet goodness still exists, often in the smallest decisions, made by people who choose to stay when they don't have to.